Go on.
Is being sensitive to offence such a problem? Like we would have previously called that manners.
It's a terrible problem. So imagine you, okay, so the rule is you can't offend anyone. All right? Let's say you're speaking to one person. I can't offend you. All right, fair enough. What if I'm speaking to 10 people? Do I get to offend 1 in 10? How about 1 in 100? How about 1 in 1,000? You're going to come out on stage and you're going to say something important about something vital, and you're not going to offend one person in 1,000? Well, you can't say anything about anything important ever without offending probably the person you're talking to. Important speech about important.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Agree or Disagree, the podcast. My name is Kevin Olenek. You can, of course, follow me on Twitter at KEVOLE. You can subscribe to all podcasts on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your favorite little podcasts. Add me as a friend on Facebook, Kevin Olenek. Spreaker.com, KEVOLE is also where you can find other podcasts like Agree or Disagree, the podcast as well. And our topic today, as you heard from the beginning for the first 30 seconds of Jordan Peterson, which will either turn you on to this conversation or make you vomit. But the topic today is about free speech. Some love it. It feels it has given them the said freedom to speak their mind. Because after all, we live in either wherever you live, Canada, or if you're listening on Powercast 97.9 as well, tuned in radio, the United States, and you feel that there should be no limits. However, for others, there are some concerns. They feel that these ideas open up the opportunity for harm, irresponsibility, and danger for many. Specifically, as an example, and only one example in this that I bring up, the LGBT community. Last week, new Alberta Premier Jason Kenney has announced that he wants to follow his counterpart in Ontario, Doug Ford. He wants Alberta universities and college to conform to free speech guidelines. Now again, some may like this, but others wonder if this is an advantage or some optics towards right-wing thinking groups. The post-secondary, and I'm reading this from the Star Metro in Calgary last week, the post-secondary education section of the United Conservative Party platform says the government will require the provinces and universities, colleges to develop, post, and comply with free speech policies that conform to the University of Chicago Statement on Principles of Free Expression. Often called the Chicago Principles, the statement is the result of a university committee assembled in 2014 to state the school's commitment to freedom of expression. The short report says it is not proper role of the university to attempt to shield individuals from ideas and opinions they find unwelcome, disagreeable, or deeply offensive. Is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? Will this hurt or harm? Our guests today are going to help us unpack this conversation. We have 3 guests today. One of them is a labor lawyer on behalf of employers. He is here for fun on Twitter. Opinions are your own, but they are my own, but they should be yours too. That is Dwayne Chauvin. Welcome, Dwayne. How are you?
I'm doing wonderfully. Thank you, Kevin.
And also with us today is a guy well known on Twitter in the Alberta circles of world. Mostly Alberta talk, politics, poetry, weird things my kids say. Called by Jason Kenney, incidentally, a communist. Hashtag communist professor. He's known as Dr. J. Dr. No. Jay Gamble is with us. How are you?
I'm doing very well, thank you, Kevin. And I do want to say, first of all, that I'm absolutely honored and delighted to be among such a fine group of people. So thank you for inviting me.
Well, thank you. And that's Dwayne and our other guest. Kristen Rayworth is back with us. She is... of course, opinionated on Twitter. What? Political geek, advocate for sexual violence survivors, cabinet member for My United Way, and is with us as well. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you for having me. I'm really excited too because I've met Dwayne in person, but I've never actually heard Jay's voice and communicated with him in a sort of real world aspect. So this is very exciting.
It's always fascinating to first hear a voice, to hear someone that you meet on Twitter. It's like,
I'm really hoping that the garden gnome starts following me soon.
Yes. Yes.
Gary is here. Gary
the garden
Good.
gnome.
That's important. That's very vital.
Yes. So I guess maybe let's just start from the beginning with what this policy is and what is being brought forth. What I guess I'll have free disclosure here. I think I sense Jay would be the person that has some concerns. Dwayne has some question. May think that this is a bit open. So maybe we'll start with Dwayne here first. Not that I'm taking one side or the other, but Dwayne, why do you think that this is a good thing? What are you seeing, hearing? What are your thoughts?
At first, I was conflicted, I have to say. Universities and post-secondary institutions generally, particularly for the last 4 years, had a great degree of intrusion into their autonomy. And it came in a number of pieces of legislation and really has, if I may say, interfered with what I might call governance issues. And so my immediate reaction when I saw that the UCP might take a step in that direction was extremely cautious, is to, by and large, let's leave post-secondary institutions alone. But then as I began to read more about it, particularly statements that I read from, let's say, Professor Turk in Ontario and Moon in Ontario, indicating that post-secondary institutions are already doing this. They already have these types of policies in place. I became less concerned about it. And I realized that by having a legislative requirement like this, it might give a better legal footholding to individuals who have had their free expression rights curtailed on campuses. It might give them the legal foothold in which to seek remedies in the court. And I thought that that is appropriate. So I think that overall I've come out cautiously in favor of adopting a Chicago principle, but developed by each institution. That's what the platform seems to suggest they'll do. They're Chicago-like principles. And many of them will already probably have those in place.
Jay, what are your thoughts?
This is probably going to be a surprise to a lot of people, but I actually am absolutely in favor of free expression. That don't really have any difficulty with the Chicago principles. My issue is that the Chicago principles were developed by a university. They were not meted out by a political party to say that this must be something that all institutions do. So that was the first thing that made me uneasy. And the other thing that does make me uneasy is that, as Dwayne was saying, that a lot of our institutions and the Post-Secondary Learning Act already do, in many ways, cover student comportment or for that matter, faculty comportment, as well as the freedom of expression that we already do have that in place. And so my concern, obviously, then about this being handed down from on high is that there are going to be ulterior motives. I obviously have no evidence for that, and in some ways we are going to have to speak about this provisionally, all of us, because we don't actually have the legislation in front of us, but we can, I think, sort of surmise from Doug Ford and stuff in Ontario what might be happening. So that would be my central concern.
Okay. Kristen, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think just to build off of what Jay said, is that I think that the biggest issue that surrounds this potential legislation is the link in to Doug Ford, and the fact that under the Ford government in Ontario, this isn't just about free speech. They then went further to tie funding provided to universities based on outputs. And so that was part of this. And so it became part of a broader approach to post-secondaries that really limited it. So on one hand, you're talking about the appeal of free speech on campus. And then on the other hand, you're saying, well, we have free speech, but you can only teach the things that we deem economically viable, which is not really a fair way to approach it. I don't know very many people in politics who have what would be deemed economically viable degrees. The majority of us have like political science or sociology, which is not really sought after in the current job market, but you make it work. So I think that's part of the major issue, is that we don't know what this looks like. So a lot of this is based on fear and based on concern and based on, I think, assuming what a Kenney government could look like. So that's really problematic, because it's cart before the horse. We're having all of this debate now when we don't even know what the legislation looks like.
Is the concern valid, even though it's based in some, because we know that Kenney and Ford are friends, or they finish each other's sentences? Excuse me. Is there some valid concern, though? Like, where do we have the balance of valid concern and, okay, we're fear-mongering? I'll open that up for everybody to kind of chime in on that.
Well, I think part of it is that, it doesn't really help that a lot of the language and some of the legislation that's coming out of the UCP right at the gate very much mirrors the Doug Ford government. So when you're talking about the Open for Business Act, that's basically word for word what you've seen coming out of Ontario. And this is something that's existed in Ontario. So I understand that, but I really do think that people need to wait and see what this looks like. We also have to understand that within it's not going to also mirror what came out of the United States, which is where, again, this came out of. The Chicago principles were parroted by Trump, but they don't have the same hate speech legislation that we do in Canada. So even the woman who helped put it into law in Ontario talked about how difficult that was and how much you have to sort of move with it and change it to actually make it fit within Canadian laws. So I think that a lot of this is really important to wait and to see what it actually looks like and have discussions. But again, the biggest problem, and maybe this is Twitter, I don't know, but when you start trying to have discussions about what this could look like, people go to their partisan holes immediately. And it's very difficult to have a discussion about what free speech can look like without people calling each other names and without it immediately descending into that. So it becomes very difficult to have a policy debate on something like this right now.
Anyone?
My perspective.
Go ahead.
Sorry, my perspective. It's Dwayne. My perspective is a little bit different. The UCP, to their credit, put out a very detailed platform, and in that platform, they indicated quite clearly what they intended with respect to this provision. Each institution, the platform says, will be able to go away and draft their own policy. Many may already have that in place. At the risk of repeating, I have to point that out. And that it has to be consistent with the Chicago principle. And so they've given us a roadmap. It's true that they don't, in the platform, outline what the consequence will be for violations, and that's fine. We'll have to wait to see about that. But the suggestion that it's hard to draft legislation given that the legal frameworks between Canada and the United States differ is, with respect, nonsense on stilts. The fact of the matter is, even in the United States, they have limits on free speech. They have a very robust definition of it, but you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. Obscenity laws are not protected. You can't incite violence. They have limitations. And the Chicago principles recognize that. You actually have to do nothing in terms of further drafting to incorporate our laws. Our laws, of course, they include hate speech, but that's illegal speech. It's no different than obscenity. It's no different than inciting violence. These are provisions that are in the criminal code. You can't defame. The Chicago principle says you can't do it. You can't violate general law. I think very little will have to be amended because the Chicago principles are very clear that it's subject to the legal framework, including the regulation of the time, place, and manner of the speech. So I think it's really compatible with our framework of laws.
Well, and just to quickly jump in, those weren't my words; those were the words of the people within Ontario who tried to draft that bill.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, Kristen. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to suggest they were yours. I've seen those all over Twitter and in Ontario, and I just don't think it's accurate.
Jay, your thoughts?
Again, see, my concern is that, Dwayne, as you've already suggested, that effectively these laws are already in place. So my concern is that there is an agenda behind actually requiring universities to, or PSIs in general, to come out with something similar to the Chicago principles, because effectively those Chicago principles are already there. And I think we don't. I mean, I don't think we need to look any further than people like Faith Goldie and others who have been invited to universities and then disinvited because of protests for that particular guest speaker. And so my concern about this is that this is not meddling in free expression, but rather meddling in or rather guaranteeing a freedom of platform to speakers who the community may not want there, and that's my concern, is that this is giving a platform to people, or guaranteeing a platform, and that really isn't about freedom of expression. And so that's my concern. And again, I'm going to keep coming back to the point that we do have to wait. I absolutely agree with that we do have to wait. But my lefty senses are tingling, as it were.
So on your campus, Jay, you're at the University of Lethbridge, correct?
That's right. And I should also say I'm speaking only for myself, not my employer. I'm sure the comms people are going to be very happy to hear me say that.
Okay, no, that's fair. Yeah, but have your university invited a Faith Goldie or anyone like that on campus? Or what's, like, if the name Faith, if someone said, hey, we should bring Faith Goldie on campus, what's the language like? What's the conversation like if that idea came up?
See, this is when I should have contacted my faculty association about this. That at the University of Lethbridge is actually influenced in many ways by a faculty member that is no longer with us, who has since retired. But the fortunate thing, I suppose, is that I was sitting on the grievance committee that dealt with his issues that are relatively public at this point. But I can't in my mind really sort of differentiate between what is public knowledge and what is knowledge just within that committee. So I'm not really going to be able to say it, but I can tell you that sort of anti-Semitism or any kind of identity-based, for lack of a better word, hate, it would certainly raise his hackles on campus, in part because of all of these issues that surrounded this faculty member.
Okay. Well, and I'm just going to build off of that, not getting into the specifics. I know the individual that Jay is speaking about, and sort of the other side of that coin, because a lot of this is framed within the context of conservative speakers or people to the right, where we're talking about pro-life people, we're talking about the Faith Goldie, Jordan Petersons of the world. When I look at when I went to university, and one of my biggest kind of quote-unquote awakenings when I was in university was around people who come in to talk about Palestine and talk about the experience of Palestinian refugees and what that was like and what their experiences were. And that is still a very controversial topic, and student groups who work in support of Palestine, it's still, there are some who obviously take it to a different extent, but that is still a very controversial concept, and that is driven by the right, who generally don't appreciate that on campus. And you've seen right-wing student groups try to go against that. So at the end of the day, I guess the point that I'm trying to make is that this isn't a right-left issue. You really do have people on all sides who deserve to be heard and deserve to have their voice heard. And that's also student-led, because that's the other thing. Is we're not talking about the University of Lethbridge or the U of A just randomly deciding, hey, we want Faith Goldie to come speak here. Generally, this is about student groups who invite people to come speak. So there is that extent of being student-led. And so I think we also have to keep that in mind. But I guess my broader point just being, it's not a right-left thing. It's about sometimes we don't want to hear opinions that we don't agree with. And I don't think that that's necessarily the best way to go into this conversation.
Yeah, and the reason I brought that up, though, is because I'm curious, because Jay has mentioned that the Post-Secondary Act covers a number of this, and I'm wondering how universities in Alberta and post-secondary institutions in Alberta have dealt with these sort of issues before. Like, is the student association saying, okay, we're not going to deal with anything, and I'm using air quotes, controversial per se, or is it open seasons, like, okay, we'll have this person come on and then this person come on? I'm curious of where we're at from a university post-secondary perspective overall.
Well, let me take the first stab at this. Let's be clear. I agree with Kristen that the beauty, the elegance of the free expression concept is that once you let it out of the bag, you don't know where it's going to go because it applies to everybody equally. That's the importance of the value. On campuses and in our communities generally, it doesn't arise very often, but it has arisen. And where it's arisen is in the Alberta context, in post-secondary institutions. It has arisen largely in the context of pro-life groups. And in a number of ways, their ability to express ideas have been truncated. Either they've been marshaled off to portions of the campus where they don't reach a particularly large audience. And most recently at the U of A, what happened was counter-protesters came. Now, counter-protesters are completely appropriate. Free speech applies to everybody. But the allegation is that the counter-protesters exercised a heckler's veto and shut them down. And the institution's response was to say that nothing wrong occurred. And the institution's response was to say that if the pro-life group wanted to come back onto campus, they had to pay the security costs, which were $170,000. That's in effect a veto on speech. And that's the context, I think, in which it arises, and it's troubling. Putting a price on speech will price out the most unpopular opinions. It's a price on speech, and it's completely unacceptable. It's before the Court of Appeal. We'll see what they do, but that's the context in which it arises in Alberta, infrequently but importantly.
So to counter and to challenge that point of view, there are a number of concerns about it's not just the topic that is the concern. It is the way that that topic has been presented with some extremely graphic images that I'm going to use the word because it's the best word that I can find, that are triggering and have been known to be damaging and have caused a deep psychological pain to people, and they're not comfortable with these images being displayed in such a public way that it's almost, in a sense, some would say that is a violation of others' free speech, in that they're seeing something that they do not want to see, they haven't wished to see, or need to see. Does that make sense?
It does, Kevin, but let me challenge you in this regard. None of the images are illegal. The images are perfectly lawful. You have the right to offend. you have the right to shock, you have the right to disturb. Those are features of free expression. And so let's shift the example. If you go onto Twitter, you'll find a site called the Auschwitz Memorial. Now let's assume for a moment the Auschwitz Memorial supporters come on campus, and I invite you to go there and look at the media. You are going to see shocking and horrifying pictures of people in internment. Yet, I do not believe that if they went to the U of A on the Holocaust Memorial Day and posted those shocking pictures, that they would be subjected to the same treatment. And the soldiers of Odin may be very offended by it, even perhaps triggered. But that's not a reason to truncate their free expression rights.
Okay, I'm just going to jump in here for a second. First of all, I just want to emphasize that to compare images from Auschwitz and their legitimacy to the images that pro-life people use, which are factually and scientifically inaccurate, I just want to make sure that we're very clear on the difference between those two things. What you were talking about with pro-life protesters, who again, they have the right to spread their nonsense as much as they want to. It is completely factually inaccurate. So I want to be very clear when we're talking about this that we are not drawing a distinction between those two things. Because when you are talking about a woman who has an abortion at 6 to 8 weeks into her pregnancy and then showing that as basically a mini little baby, that's not accurate. So I just want to make sure that we're being very, very clear on that. Secondly, as it relates to the issue of pro-life protesters, they absolutely have the right to do what they want. They have a right to be where they want. I drove down through southern Alberta this weekend, and driving down the highway on the QE2, you get to see a lot of very exciting pro-life posters. Again, completely factually inaccurate. And that's just the way that things are. You see those things, and it is important to understand that those things are there. I don't necessarily think it's an act of violence to have to see them. I do, however, want to ensure through the course of this legislation that students have a right to counter protest those things, because that's the other thing, is especially when we're talking about pro-life activists, a lot of their activism is based on lies and scientific inaccuracies. So if people want to counter protest that and they want to talk to the protesters and have those conversations, that should be their right as well.
Yeah,
you'll have no quarrel about anything on that from me.
Yeah, I'm not saying that they don't have a right to be there. I think that although, to me, it's about approach, and I think however you look at it, and I know some people that have sat on the pro-life side that are very, very uncomfortable with those images being shared, and it's actually quite offensive in many that I know that are sitting on the pro-life, however you want to word it, community, that are very uncomfortable with them, and they do cause a harm and danger. And so that's where I wanted to counter that a little bit. But go ahead. Anyway, go ahead. Jay, did you have thoughts?
I have many. I was just waiting patiently, so thank you. Absolutely. I would agree with Kristen entirely that they do have a right to be there. That they are factually inaccurate beyond simply the abuses of metaphor. Anyway, like genocide, it is not in any way like lynching. That's a metaphor. That's suffering from abuse. I mean, that's like saying a dandelion is just, it's not anything like it. And so, they are absolutely free to be there and do that. I even wrote an email to the president of my university when they first started showing up in the bus loop. This is something else that should be identified as well, is that this is not on a stage. This is not in some classroom where there's a lecture going on, but this is out in a public space. And because it's a public space, that's also why they have the right to be there. And so, that's something that we just simply have to deal with, because a university is also a public space, and so because of that, we do have to allow for that freedom of expression, and that's fine. But again, as Kristen has said, that right to counter protest absolutely needs to be there, and I suppose that's one of my concerns, is that I don't think that there's any way that you can fight any kind of protester showing up on a campus, public spaces. I don't think that that's possible, because that's freedom of expression. That law is in place. Where you are going to have, I think, difficulty is with the stage, the invited speakers onto campuses. And if a student group, and again, as Kristen has said, this is often student groups, student-led groups who invite these controversial speakers, which is their right to do so, but it's also the right of others to protest against it. And if you hamstring the protesters and say, your protest we're going to actually make ineffective, that you're not actually going to be able to cancel it. So yeah, you can beak off and do whatever. That in some ways is taking away the efficacy of their freedom of expression as well, is what I would say. But I would defer obviously to the lawyer in this instance, if that's the case, Dwayne.
Well, and I'll let Dwayne talk, but I just wanted to make one point too. I think the other thing that's missed within this is, and I think we were talking about this actually, Jay, before you came on and before we started recording, is that sometimes the demand to have someone banned and the demand to have someone deplatformed actually does them more of a benefit than a negative. And the example that I used earlier was the amazing BBC interview from last week with Ben Shapiro, where he just got destroyed by this BBC guy. And it was wonderful to watch him get asked questions and not be able to answer them, and then basically like throwing his microphone down and leaving. And the reality is oftentimes we do more of a service to our cause and to the cause that we believe in by having these people and debating these people like Ben Shapiro, because the second that we deplatform them or we protest them, that actually increases their reach. Jordan Peterson wouldn't be Jordan Peterson if he didn't have all of that public to do about him. If he hadn't become a public, person you love to hate, he wouldn't have as many followers as he does and be a best-selling author. That just wouldn't be the case. So sometimes actually just letting someone go and embarrass themselves can sometimes be better.
Sometimes, absolutely, I would agree with you, without a doubt. But also sometimes we get people who simply espouse, as you said, for instance, with the pro-life groups, absolute lies. And then how long does it take for someone to unpack those lies before they've moved on to their next lie? Right? It's that baffle them with bull crap. This isn't Twitter, so I'll...
You can say bullshit.
Okay.
It's okay.
Gary's whispering it in my ear. So that in that sense, yeah, if they have those tactics to be able to do that, then they're just spouting out lies, and they aren't really able to be. I see benefits to both letting them have their say and then being shown to be a fool, and also to absolutely protest them.
Well, and the other thing is it's deeply ironic, and then I'll stop talking and actually let Dwayne answer because I know he's been waiting. It's deeply ironic to have four people who are blessed to have the platform that the four of us do, and we get to say whatever the hell we want every day on Twitter. And there's no one coming at us for the stuff that we say. I mean, Jay got called a commie. I get called a UCP shill who's apparently secretly dating Jason Kenney. We all have our cross to bear on social media. Mine is weirder than Jay's, but still. But we have a platform, and if someone tried to deny us our platform, I can only imagine the reaction. So I think we also just have to be conscientious of that when we're talking about free speech, that we're four people who have incredibly blessed opportunities to share our views every day. But
before I let Dwayne jump, sorry, Dwayne, what I will also say to that is there is a difference between creating shockwaves for the hell of it and making money out of creating shockwaves, which is what Ben Shapiro and I'm going to specifically use Ben Shapiro and Ann Coulter as examples of being they're out there and they're making their business is creating shockwaves. and they've masqueraded it as dialogue. And those that legitimately want to have a conversation and ask some tough questions, and to use a phrase that to use a phrase that I used before we started recording also, is not be a dick about it. And I do think ultimately that's the way I think people want to converse. One person, I don't agree with her on pretty much 70% of what she has to say, but I'm more than willing to listen to someone like Allie Beth Stuckey, even though I disagree with her, because she's not out there trying to piss people, trying to insult people. She's legitimately trying to have a conversation. That was what Rachel Held Evans, the late author that unfortunately passed away recently, that was what she was known for, is to invite people into a conversation. I think that there's more value in that than that form of platform than there is ultimately in the shock and awe business that I think Ben Shapiro is in, and I think that Ann Coulter is in, and I think that Faith Goldie is in. Dwayne's like, can I talk now?
No, I'm enjoying the conversation. Let's step back on a couple of principles. We've talked about the Charter. By and large, the Charter isn't applying here. These aren't government actions. These are, if I may say, liberal values. And one of the liberal values is that you actually do get to speak things that are untrue. That is part of free expression. It's how we arrive at truth. And we've all accepted that there are reasonable limits to speech, whether it's obscenity, hate in Canada, other defamation. But we've also not dealt with one aspect of it, which Jay's raising. And that is not the right to protest, because of course he's absolutely right. The right to protest is also a protected form of speech. But he used the phrase at one point, to shut down. And that is the heckler's veto. And our law has not developed around the concept of the heckler's veto. That's a fairly robustly developed concept in the United States. And coming out of their free speech traditions, they basically say, what's the underlying policy of free speech? It's the exchange of ideas. It is the ability to correct that untruthful information, to use Kristen's example from earlier, destroy Ben Shapiro. And so that the heckler's veto is actually antithetical to the concept of free expression, that's the reasonable limit. Protest all you wish, but don't commit the torts of trespass, watching and besetting. You can't actually shut down that speaker. And it isn't because it's only the speaker's right of free expression that's being shut down, but it's also the right of that audience to hear it. That's also an expressive activity. And to have that one side of the debate and be able to compare it to the other. So that's where I would draw the line, and I expect that we're going to see the law in Canada develop that way as well. And I think it should.
Sorry, can I just ask for a little bit of a clarification there, Dwayne? You were cutting out a little bit. So you think the law in Canada is going to move towards preventing what you called the heckler's veto?
I believe that is where it will go, because if you don't, the state, you are actually preferring one speech over the other. And I don't think that that's the role of the state. I don't think that's the role of individual actors. Other than their own personal choice, I am persuaded by this argument, not I will shut down the argument. And, I gave the example on Twitter. There are climate deniers who feel very strongly about it. Mm-hmm. And imagine if they organized and decided that every time Andrew Leach and Trevor Tome spoke, they were going to go and exercise a heckler's veto.
Isn't that called A.B. Ledge?
That's a fair comment. But you can see the absurdity of it, right? And where it can lead to.
Okay, yes, sir, absolutely. In terms of once the person shows up on campus and is beginning to speak and interrupting that person and drowning them out, absolutely I would agree with that I think it needs to be dealt with. And example, I've forgotten the University of Notre Dame, they had the vice president show up to give a talk, and a huge number of students stood up and walked out.
And you know what? Walking out is fine. Walk out as much as you want. Like, that's the ultimate. That's the other thing about this is that when we talk about people coming to campus you don't like, you don't have to go.
Yeah.
And by not going and by not giving your voice or your money or whatever to the person, that also sends itself a sign. And, you know, I think the other thing that when we talk about campus issues, and this is something I tweeted about yesterday, is we are looking at students who, and I'm going to sound so old now, so I'm just going to take a moment to embrace what's about to happen. Kids these days, students on campus, you see a lot of them reacting incredibly negatively to anything that counteracts their worldview. And that is not what being in university is supposed to be about. And for example, in the United States at Harvard University, a law professor has lost his job because in his private time as a practicing lawyer, he's on Harvey Weinstein's defense team. Harvey Weinstein is garbage, but he is deserving of a robust defense in his trial. That's it. And to lose your job as a result of that because students feel like you just doing that is enough for you to merit losing your job, that's not what the real world looks like. And so we need to be able to start having conversations with people, especially on campus, about learning to see opinions that you don't agree with, arguing with opinions you don't agree with, and maybe just ignoring opinions you don't agree with. Because all of these, but shutting them down is not the way to grow the way you see the world.
Well, Marie Heinen as well. If you remember, she took a huge amount of heat for defending Jian Ghomeshi, to the point that some were questioning her politics and things too. She still is. She's been like all the last couple of days since she was back in the media because of the Mark Norman case. She's been called a bad feminist. She's been called, she should be ashamed of herself. She was doing her job. Yeah.
I do not care for Jian Ghomeshi at all, but she was doing her job, and it's unfair to put a different expectation on women or on lawyers than we do on other people. They're doing their job.
But do you mind if Jay, I'd be interested in your perspective on this, and it comes from some of the materials I've read by Jonathan Haidt, where he speaks about 2012, the notion that language is violence, that hate speech isn't just hate speech, it becomes speech you hate. Have you noticed a shift in students? Is that something that he's right about? This concept of language is actually causing physical violence to you.
Sorry, can I just ask for clarification on what you're asking? Do I see a shift in the students' attitudes towards uncomfortable topics?
Yes, and if I could say, when I was in university 100 years ago, that concept it was completely foreign. It was, you could virtually have any speech on campus, and we had, wildly different views. And what Jonathan Haidt talks about, he says that in about 2012, he noticed the concept that students were bringing forward this idea that language was violent, that some speech was violent. It actually caused them to be violently sick. Has there been a change in the student population that you've noticed, or is he wrong about that?
That's interesting. I do think that students have currently, I would argue, and again, this is anecdotal evidence. This is just me in the classroom that I'm responding to and being on campus. Is that students are a lot more aware of the way in which language can do things, right? That words aren't just words, but they are performatives. That things actually happen with words, and that not all language necessarily is violent, but this is, I suppose, where my concern about this is that you have a speaker who comes in and who starts using derogatory epithets of whatever group of people it happens to be. This, you have to realize, is also the learning environment of, at least at the University of Lethbridge, almost 9,000 students. And is that conducive to that learning environment? If we have a university then who's allowing for that kind of speech, and it's not hate speech, it certainly wouldn't hold up in court, from my understanding. It's uncomfortable, it's deeply offensive, but it also, I would argue, does something. It's not just words. And so, as an example, I was going to actually challenge what Kristen, you said to some extent about students today, kids these days. From my experience in the classroom, students are absolutely receptive to challenging ideas and to having their ideas challenged. For instance, just today in Canadian poetry, I struggled a great deal with bringing Duncan Campbell Scott into the classroom as a poet. And for those of you who don't know, he was also the highest civil servant in the government in the Indian Affairs, in the Ministry of Indian Affairs, and he is effectively responsible for residential schools. And so obviously there's a sort of a resituating of Duncan Campbell Scott within the poetic tradition of Canada. Had a student discussion about that, and it was astonishing. That I'm really glad I brought him into the classroom to have that discussion. And yes, it's deeply uncomfortable, and some of the stuff, his views of Indigenous peoples in Canada was deeply offensive. But the students dealt with it, and the students talked about it reasonably and responsibly and maturely. And in some ways, I felt badly about myself, doubting whether they would be able to deal with this. And it was an exceptional class because of the students today, because of that. So I would say that students today aren't necessarily snowflakes, or whatever the pejorative term that is often used about students, and the pejorative terms of, or the pejorative perceptions of Generation X. These aren't snowflakes. These are students who are wildly politically aware in ways that I certainly wasn't at their age or at their stage in life. So it's I suppose that's where I am in terms of that idea of free speech. I'm absolutely in favor of freedom of expression on campus. I am deeply uncomfortable with a government demanding that we have the Chicago principles established. In the same way, I just want to say that this isn't, Kristen, as you said earlier, it's not a left and right issue. I took some serious flack from the left because I actually defended Lindsay Shepherd bringing Jordan Peterson into the classroom, because I don't like administration meddling in the affairs of the classroom. We don't really know what she was doing with that clip of Jordan Peterson. We don't know what pedagogical strategies she was using. Yes, there's a little bit of a difference in that she was a TA as opposed to instructor of record, but fundamentally, I don't think administration should be meddling in the affairs of the classroom, unless obviously illegal things happen or what have you. In the same way that I don't think the government should be meddling in the affairs of the university. And to come back to my point about the disinvitation of speakers, absolutely, I would agree with you, Dwayne, about this. The heckler's veto, that I think that's deeply disrespectful, and that has happened on campus here with the professor, with faculty and some graduate students and so on, that did happen. I disagree with it. But if students beforehand organize and protest, and then the university administration says, geez, maybe we sort of miscalculated what our community wants, and then they disinvite, does that then suddenly mean that the UCP government says, oh, well, you're going to suffer financial hardships because of that, because your funding is going to be tied to the free speechiness of your campus? And how does one go about evaluating free speechiness anyway?
Jade, let me ask you this. Typically, the freedoms that we cherish most, mm-hmm. they're not there to protect the majority. Mm-hmm. They're not there. They're there to protect the minority. They're there to protect the outliers. So you have a community that says, we don't want a Jordan Peterson, or let's take it even, for heaven's sakes, Christine Blatchford. She was run off the campus. We don't want her on campus. But isn't it illiberal to say that the majority is going to overrule the minority?
I don't think. All right, I did say that a lot of students are deeply politically aware and involved. I don't think that I would ever say that a majority of students on campus would be for or against a speaker coming in. So yes, I do understand that this is in order to protect the minority or those with views that may not be seen. So, for instance, perhaps we could look at freedom of expression and say that perhaps the progress that we have made in terms of LGBTQ2S plus people, that the progress that we have made may not have happened had it not been for free expression. And so I do absolutely understand that, but at the same time, I do think that that they have some kind of agency on campus in their learning environment where they are paying a heap of money to be, and to have the reputation of their university, of their degree on the line by saying, yeah, the university brought in Ezra Levant 3 times or whoever it happens to be, that could be argued to tarnish the quote unquote, and I hate to use this term, brand of the university.
So and again, I'm going to interject here specifically on the example of Christy Blatchford. When we're talking about protecting the minority and minority voices, so Christy Blatchford has a history of basically attacking sexual assault survivors. Every article she ever posts as it relates to sexual violence is an opportunity for her to attack sexual assault survivors. She attacks them from Reka Parsons, who she went after, and her family, to anyone. That is her bread and butter, apparently. So as, someone who hasn't been on campus for a long time, if I was on campus as a 17, 18, 19-year-old, damn right I would protest her being there, in the sense of not wanting somebody who banks her money in rape myths to be on campus. She has a right to do what she wants. She has a right to say what she wants. She has a right to have her column, and she has a right to be there if that's what she chooses to do. But when we're talking about minority rights, a lot of the speakers that we're talking about, Christy Blatchford, anti-LGBTQ, anti-trans speaker, we are not talking about people who are defending the minority view here. We are not talking about minimized speakers who somehow the university is giving them a platform they never would have otherwise. Christy Blatchford is an opinion columnist for the National Post. Her views they're all across the country before the majority of sexual violence survivor advocates have an opportunity to speak their voice. So I think let's be clear on the power differential here, is that when we're talking about a lot of these speakers, we're talking about people who have a significant amount of power and voice. And if they are not able to speak at one university, that is not going to limit their reach in any way.
Mm-hmm. Exactly, and it comes back once again to my distinction, and again, I don't know that this is necessarily a legal distinction, but a distinction between the freedom of expression and a guaranteed platform. That I don't that you're guaranteed a platform at a university. Now, may I just ask one question here of everyone? Because my feeling is that this is being implemented by the UCP because there is a belief that conservative voices are not heard on campuses. Would people agree to that?
I wouldn't agree that that's the rationale behind the UCP doing this. I think that their perspective is a lot of them, and I think Jason Kenney, Premier Kenney, is a free speech absolutist, and they believe in the concept of free speech. I don't think it's tied to conservative ideas. I think it's tied to their fundamental belief in the concept of free speech and the belief that that is not happening right now. I wouldn't say that they are specifically tying it necessarily to conservative values.
I would think that I might disagree a little bit. I think there is a perception among conservatives that it's, when you look at all of these instances, I might be wrong, there may be an exception that I'm not aware of, but they tend
There
to
is,
be
I believe.
conservative voices that are shut down.
I would tend to agree with Dwayne on that as well. In that, I was just recently listening to Meghan McCain making the case that we're not hearing conservative. Just using that as an example, but I do think that there is a perception among conservative people that we're not hearing, that those voices are not being heard.
Okay, well, two things: the irony of Meghan McCain, who is a talk show host on a nationally broadcast talk show host, complaining that you don't hear conservative voices when she gets to have a national platform every single day, is a little rich to me. And secondly, and then I'll stop being argumentative, but it is very rich to me that we are hearing conservatives talk about this and talk about feeling that their voices aren't being heard and that they are being denied a piece of the post-secondary world, when these are the same people who last year lost their minds when David Suzuki got an honorary doctorate. Like, you can't have it both ways.
Right.
But I think you can, with respect. The difference in the reaction, and I'm going to invite a question at the end of this, but the difference in the reaction was that they complained, they lobbied, they wrote letters about David Suzuki. They did not exercise a heckler's veto. I can go through a list of at least 10 people. I could probably rattle them off in 10 seconds that are all conservative voices. Can we name one Liberal who has been the subject of a heckler's veto?
Well, actually, I would say, and I'm going to precurse this because I am actually not a fan of him, but I would say that David Suzuki has faced heckling, not to the extent that he's been has he been interrupted on a university campus by a bunch of people shutting him down for a speech? No. Has he been mocked and embarrassed by certain media groups? Yes, he has. And here's another example: Tempora Berman.
Yeah. Because if I remember, the Conservatives lost their goddamn mind because she was speaking at a conference and wanted her kicked off the conference and wanted her gone.
Yeah, she has faced a hell of a lot of abuse, actually, for actually just being hired for a job, really.
Just existing, apparently, is enough.
Existing has been a problem.
So again, the point is when we talk about Tempora Berman, we talk about, and I'm probably butchering her name, so if...
Tempora Berman, I believe. I don't think you're butchering it as bad as you think you are.
Okay, sorry. But again, so the reaction to her, the reaction to people on the left, even just the reaction to people like Progress Alberta and Duncan Kenny, every time he does a media appearance, people on the conservative right lose their minds. So we need to have some consistency. If you want to talk about enabling a platform for people with conservative views, then you have to stop demonizing people on the left who have opinions that you don't agree with.
But I don't agree with that at all. There's a huge distinction between a heckler's veto and strong opinions about a person.
Well, I agree with you on that, but I've seen that line with both Berman and Suzuki be crossed. And it's not necessarily that it's the heckler's veto per se that you're talking about, but it's gotten to the place of personal attack. It's gotten to the place of why are you existing, and name calling and all that sort of stuff. And it may not fit a heckler's veto.
And with Tempora Berman, I believe it was the and Jay probably knows better than I do. I think it was the ATA conference. I can't remember where she was speaking. Then Notley spoke immediately after her. But there was demands from the UCP, from conservatives, to have her disinvited.
Wasn't Suzuki invited to that? And actually, UCP were all over that too?
I don't remember if he was there, but she spoke. And I remember there being a lot of people on the right, including the UCP, wanting her not to speak and wanting her disinvited. So we need to be consistent. That's the major thing about this. This is not, again, a left or right issue. Because, again, when we talk about the Palestine movement on campus and the Palestinian student groups who talk about trying to protest against what they see as issues with the way that the state of Israel operates within their lands, they're also have faced numerous issues around their freedom of speech on campus. So this is not just as simply a right-wing issue.
No. Jay, what are you thinking?
I was actually just thinking about asking Dwayne a question, if that's all right. Because Dwayne, you keep bringing up the idea of the heckler's veto, but you were okay with the way in which the right handled David Suzuki getting the honorary degree. So if, say, a student group invited, say, Faith Goldie, and another student group began a letter writing campaign, wrote to administrators, began a protest that said, we don't want her on our campus. This is not who we want. And then administration then relents. Would you consider that to be a heckler's veto, or is that good political organizing?
I would say this. I would defend, let's call it the critics, whether it's the critics of Ms. Berman or the critics of Ms. Goldie. You and I are completely aligned that you have the right to protest in every way that is lawful, short of a heckler's veto. And so I would defend both those cases equally.
Okay.
Because that is a proper exercise of free speech. Faith Goldie is an interesting example because there's a very good chance that some of her language may well cross into hate speech. But let's assume for the moment that it doesn't. Then I would say that as a post-secondary institution, you shouldn't deplatform. That doesn't mean that people can't show up as well in protest, but short of a heckler's veto, absolutely, it's a marketplace of ideas. And try to convince people not to go. That's a perfectly legitimate expressive action.
So then just by that...
So you disagree with disinviting is what your response is?
So by that argument, I just wanted to clarify one thing. So if the University of Alberta invites Naomi Klein to come give a speech on climate change, in which she then, as she would, criticizes the oil and gas industry within Alberta, and as would be expected, our new energy war room criticizes that, and our government criticizes that, and asks for her not to be invited, which I believe that they would do if she ever came into Alberta, specifically to the U of A, you would not support them in that.
No, I would support anybody. I'm going to just draw a distinction. I'd support anybody who says, I don't want this speaker on campus. Jay's right. That is a perfectly lawful right of expression, and it's perfectly legitimate. And so to go to your example of Ms. Klein, anybody is free to say, I think this is a mistake, you shouldn't do it. Now, I'm going to be a little bit cautious about that so-called war room, because I hadn't thought of that example. But remember, you're now putting the power of the state, a war room aimed at an individual. And I feel uncomfortable about that. I'd have to sort that through. But I think that the fact that it is a state actor, as opposed to a group of students who don't want to hear Ms. Klein or Ms. Goldie, there may be a distinction there. I'd have to wrap my mind around that.
Okay.
So what about, I'm just curious then, this is not on campus, but this did happen. But the way when Justin Trudeau was doing his town halls across Canada, were we okay with the people that were booing him out of the building? Let's take away the fact of whether we love or dislike Justin Trudeau or not, but it is an example of what has been talked about here, I think.
Well, speaking as probably the most publicly non-favorite of the Liberal Party amongst the three of us, I think that Justin Trudeau doing those town halls, that's one of the best things that he's done. by far and away as Prime Minister. Like he goes, he takes those hard questions. He actually does well generally with those hard questions. I think that if there's one example of him really, really, really doing extremely well as Prime Minister, it's that. I think that everybody has a right to their opinion. You have a right to go to those things. And I respect the hell out of the fact that his staff don't vet. They don't sit there and ask people before they go in what they're there for. And that is very different from what happened under Stephen Harper. Stephen Harper would never have allowed somebody to come into that room and grill him the way that Trudeau does again and again and again. So I think those people have every right to do what they want. They have every right to leave if they want. They have every right to attack him if they want in a respectful way. But I think that those do more good for Trudeau than they do damage to anything else.
But there have been times during those town halls, I specifically remember the one in Nanaimo as an example, where no one could get in a question. There was a couple of ladies that were insistent on just interrupting everybody because of what he said. To me, that crosses into Dwayne's heckler's veto. I don't think that that's appropriate. But they also
I agree with you. Boo him going in, boo him going out. I don't think there's anything wrong with clapping if you like him and booing an answer you don't like, but you can't interfere with his ability to get through the material. At that point, you've crossed a line.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, mm-hmm. And to point out what Kristen said earlier, this wasn't a left or right thing. Those were two people on the left that were doing that. Well, I'm assuming
he's been challenged by people on the right too.
Absolutely.
Like he had someone ask him why he wanted to bring Sharia law into.
Oh yeah, of course.
He's dealt with both sides of
Absolutely.
the craziness.
Yeah. We're on the same page there. Absolutely.
And the power of free expression is, as I said before, you let it go, and I'll try to suck up to Kristen. It's like a dragon. It's like a dragon.
Oh, you're Game of Thrones me now.
Yes, it goes where it wants to go, and it applies equally to left, right, indifferent. It's the underlying principles that apply, and that's the uncomfortable part about it.
That's very true.
The moment you start saying, I think X should not be entitled to speak, the moment you say David Suzuki shouldn't be allowed to speak, and stop him and say that was appropriate, then you need to be able to apply it to everybody else, including your favorite. And if it's Jordan Peterson, the same rules have to apply.
Yeah, and it goes back to that saying, like, I don't agree with what you say, but I'll, defend your right to say it for the rest of my days. Like, that's the reality. If you believe in free speech, you believe in free speech for everybody. It's not I like you better so you get to do what you want type thing.
Okay. So I have three more topics that I want to get to here. The first one is around the concept of the safe space. I don't know if you had a chance to watch the Nationals report I don't know if this was how recent this was, but it was fairly recent around a men's group that was started at Ryerson that they were trying to shut down to the point that the guy running it stepped down and it was taken over by a woman. But the argument from the LGBTQ community was this kind of stuff, and a lot of these talkers that we have talked about today are causing harm to that community, and there is a need to have a safe space for them. So I guess I have two questions. What are your thoughts on the concept of safe space? And the second question that I have is, it may be beyond the free speech part, are we getting to the point that there are certain groups that we may not want or be allowed on campus? Is there a legitimate argument around that?
Do you mean not on campus in general, or not on campus?
Like, as an example, they're in that that national piece, there was a suggestion that that pro-life groups, university groups, be banned from being part of campus. Like they are, and sort of the men's rights groups should be banned on campus.
May I tackle this first?
Sure.
Okay. So the first thing that I would say is that that's absurd. It's ridiculous to say that people who are pro-life should not be on campus, shouldn't be able to organize, and shouldn't be able to protest. Whether I agree with the way in which the abusers of metaphor do it, that's another thing. But you want to have an actual discussion about free choice or anti-choice, pro-life, then go ahead. I absolutely am in favor of that. The shock stuff, I'm not so keen on, but it's their right to do so. Right? That's their right. So what about men's rights? You know, often we hear about men's rights and so on. And one of the things that I can say is that in a class discussion that we had, one person was talking about, a male student was talking about setting up a men's center on campus, and I thought, what a ridiculous thing. Men don't need men's centers. It's absurd. And then he proceeded to lay out a cogent argument with supporting evidence, and he absolutely changed my mind. And I thought, you know what? If you want to set up a men's campus, I think that would be, or on campus, that I think that would be a fantastic idea. And I never thought I would have said that. So the MRAs that go in and break up meetings or attempt to make people intentionally uncomfortable, maybe prevent that from happening, but removing them from campus, no, I disagree with that.
What about the importance of safe space, though? Oh, sorry, Kristen, but what about the importance of the idea of safe space?
There are so many different sort of versions of safe space. Can you provide me an example with what you're talking about so I don't misspeak?
Okay, I'll use a personal example here. I maybe was a bit irresponsible for me to do this, but the way I worded it was probably irresponsible. But back in January, there was the whole conversation around the kids that was wearing the Make America Great Again hat. The hat that...
Oh, at MRU.
Well, that too. But specifically around the protests where the kids went, and that the one kid was face to face with the Indigenous guy, and so I just simply asked the question. When you see that hat, what emotion comes out, or what comes out? And I got a private message, someone feeling quite angry that I provided a space for people that were pro-hat to attack. And that there was not a safe space for people to go. And why are you not providing a safe space?
From a hat?
From the conversation around the hat.
Well, my answer is fairly easy. But there is no safe space in the public square.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
I agree.
I'll jump in here quickly because the concept of safe space really started in a lot of ways as it related to conversations on campus around sexual violence. So that's what that term initially meant. So when you would look at conversations that would take place around Sexual Violence Awareness Months on campus before it was a provincial thing, Sexual Exploitation Week within Edmonton, a lot of that would be, okay, well, we have a safe space. For example, if this is upsetting for you and bringing stuff up for you, there's going to be a room where you can go to speak to a therapist if you need time. So that's what that concept used to mean to me before it became kind of a catch-all for this concept. And I agree with Dwayne, there is no safe space in the real world. And I think the biggest detriment that the concept of safe spaces does to us, and I will say specifically for me, working within the area of sexual violence and advocating on this issue is it leads us to consistently speak to and preach to the converted. We never have conversations outside of our zone and outside of the people who already bought into the issues that matter to us. I think safe spaces generally tend to discourage debate. They discourage you to have uncomfortable conversations, and they discourage you from being able to spread the message of the things that matter to you beyond the people who are already willing to hear it. And that can be a detriment to the causes that people believe in. So that's my issue with safe spaces. As it relates to banning people on campus, again, I'm very much on the right. I'm pro-choice. I'm soups pro-choice. I don't believe that pro-life people should have their voices taken away. I don't think that's what we talked about when we talk about what feminism is, what choice is. This is an issue I've had for a while as it relates to, for example, the debate around Rachel Harder, who's a Conservative Party MP. I don't give a shit what her personal opinion is. That's her choice. And that's what feminism and what women's choices are. You are allowed to feel and believe what you want. That doesn't mean that she's going to make that a legislative choice. She's going to be a backbencher. And regardless, even if she isn't, it's a government decision. And the government has already said they aren't going to legislate on this. So the fact that we police women on their opinions as it relates to things that we don't deem socially acceptable anymore is, again, not an acceptable way of dealing with these issues. So again, just to go back to, I'm rambling, to go back to what Jay said, I completely agree with him. We should not deny these people space on campus. We should really be debating and conversing and talking with them, because I think we'd all be really surprised how much we could probably find in common with a lot of these groups.
Dwayne, did you comment?
No, other than my comment about there is no safe space in the public square.
Okay.
There just isn't.
Okay. The second one comes to in terms of the bigger picture here, because we have this. We're having this. This really is about campus, but I think that there's a bigger picture here, and we're all on Twitter. We've all had arguments on Twitter. We've all had stuff said about us on Twitter. We've all felt someone has called offside. I know that we've seen that Twitter is a cesspool, but is Twitter causing us to not know how to argue anymore? Like, is there now room where you and I can sit and say, okay, we disagree on this and this, but I still love you and still want to be your friend?
On Twitter?
But I think in real life too. Like, let's go back to the Alberta election. There were people that I know of, family members that were turning away other family members because they believed they were going to either vote A for Notley or B for Kenney. There were just a lot of people that were just more than willing to shut you down in some way, shape, or form if you did not vote the way that they wanted you to vote. And it was partially, yes, we saw that on Twitter, but I do know, like, I'm not living in Alberta, but I do know from talking to people in Alberta that it was becoming very personal in the public and private square too, in personal life. So I guess my question is are we losing the ability to argue with respect?
Yes.
On Twitter, absolutely. I mean, Twitter, if you're looking for reasoned political discourse on Twitter, you might as well look for a philosophical discourse at a bear baiting. I mean, it's not. This is a far more, a far better platform, I would argue, for actual reasoned discourse. Twitter, 280 characters and a whole bunch of angry trolls, not the place to actually have it.
Well, and I think too, like, Twitter tends to be a space where people resort to their partisan base and they play to that base. And I remember having this discussion with a couple of other people from Twitter on another podcast that I did, and we were talking about how everybody gets that moment where, like, you lay down some, like, serious shitty comment on someone and people are like lighting you up like your comment is the best thing they've ever seen, and it does fuel you. Like negative comments on Twitter or shady comments or being mean to someone, like there's a lot about that medium that I think encourages us to be the least best part of ourselves sometimes. Mm-hmm. And the other part of it is that there's no room for nuance. You can't have a nuanced debate. And like, I will give some credit to our beloved co-host here, Dwayne. Dwayne tries real hard to be like nuanced and have this legal debate with people. But because he's seen as conservative, a lot of the time people are like, well, you just love Jason Kenney, so go fuck yourself. And that's not the way we should be conversing, but that's what happens. Mm. And I'm sorry I said the F word on your podcast.
Oh, that's fine.
I'm surprised I wasn't the first one to say it.
This Twitter is frustrating for me in one sense that the anonymity of accounts, I agree, often brings out the worst in people. But I have to say is I mute a lot of people. And so all of the negative comments that Kristen is talking about me, I just don't see. And I have to tell you is I have been persuaded I was wrong numerous times on the platform by some really smart people or moving off the platform onto direct messaging. Mm-hmm. I have learned a tremendous amount on that about myself. I draw the line for me from mute to block when they're swearing at me or insulting me. That's where I'll cross. I try not to do that to other people, and unless I have a migraine and I'm really cranky, I don't do that.
Unless you're going full Sheila Cobbs.
Okay, I did there, but in fairness, I've really found it. I invite people from Twitter to my office for drinks all the time. We're on the highway towards Calgary. People drop in. They're my Twitter friends, and I disagree with them completely, but I have found the venue by and large positive thanks to the mute button.
I would agree with you, Kevin. I have some very dear friends that I wouldn't have met without Twitter. But that's sort of a personal connection that is, I would argue, beyond the political discourse that we were talking about. Because really, again, Kristen, as you were saying, that the lack of nuance really doesn't allow for these kinds of in-depth discussions.
Yeah, and I think the other part of that, I mean, obviously, I will point out the obvious that I have a different experience on Twitter as being the only woman in this conversation. Yep. So some of the comments that I get, whether they're from former deputy prime ministers or not, are generally very aggressive as it relates to some of the issues that I talk about. But I mean, I too have met some incredible people on Twitter, but I think that you have to, it's like you almost have to play a role on Twitter. You have to be a conservative. You have to be a left winger. You have to be this. If you aren't, if you're kind of in the middle and you like both things or you like some things on all sides, that renders you a very easy target for people on Twitter because they demand you to have 100% loyalty to one side or the other.
Although, let's look at my feed. I think some people would regard me as conservative. I'm a social liberal. I support the carbon tax. I've never been really criticized for that the way you are, Kristen. I just haven't experienced that. And it may be gender. I'm not sure all of the nuances of that, but I've never felt that I had to play a role other than what I think about something. And I do agree. I do agree with Jay. The format isn't very good for what he calls those nuanced discussions. And so I move on to direct messaging where you can get larger chunks of data.
Yeah. And I wonder if there's some people that are just, they say they're acting that they're on one side, but they're not necessarily, they're on the other. I feel like there's some peer pressure stuff going on out there that they're, at times afraid to share their opinion, or they don't want to be not one of the cool kids. It's I haven't really, I've been insulted a little bit, but certainly nothing to the degree that I've seen all three of you compared to me. It's not been the same at all.
Well, one example of this is just recently. After the cabinet swearing in, I went and was able to spend some time with people and I know people within the UCP caucus because my grandfather was a PC party person. Like, my family was very PC party. I know a lot of people in the party. So I went to celebrate the achievements of the people that I know, and I tweeted about it. And almost immediately, there were people quote tweeting me, people who have me blocked, who were able to screen cap me for whatever reason, saying see, she has no credibility. She's around the UCP. Nothing she says matters. Look at what she's doing. I have gotten that a lot around the concept of the fact that I'm deemed or considered by some people to be a conservative shill, which I am the last thing to be. Even I think this conversation has kind of shown that. But because there's no room for liking people on the other side, which is ironic given that the NDP MLAs and the UCP MLAs like each other. They're friends in real life. Mm-hmm. But that concept of liking someone personally and disagreeing with them politically does not exist on Twitter.
And I am afraid that we're moving to the type of tribal politics that we're seeing in the United States. Mm-hmm. Alberta more so than some other jurisdictions. It was particularly tribal, and it's hard to break through that barrier.
Yeah.
Yep.
The last question, there's probably a ton more that we can get into, but let's pretend that I have Jason Kenney and the cabinet here, and they're doing this legislation, and they're thinking this up. What would be a question and or a suggestion that you would give them as they're writing up this policy?
I'd heckle them.
Okay.
I'm actually thinking that was a delay tactic. I'm just thinking about what I would ask. That's a good question.
I would be asking about the enforcement mechanism.
Yes. Good. Yeah.
How do they contemplate enforcing it? I think that if they're asked to by if the post-secondary institutions are asked to by legislation, they will comply. I think that for the most part, it'll involve very little change in very few institutions. I think Jay is right. Our post-secondary institutions are liberal. And I think that the question becomes, what do you do with those few outlier cases? I wouldn't try to dissuade them from doing this. It was in their platform. I'm not absolutely convinced it's needed. In fact, if it wasn't, it'd be fine. But, we're setting policy around a single case right now that's before the Court of Appeal. And so I think that what I would be indicating to them is make sure you're not taking a hammer to this.
Yes.
The funding notion, I don't think it's required. You might be able to create a civil cause of action in which if I'm required to pay $170,000 to speak on campus, there's a mechanism for review on that. I would say to them, put some water in your wine, be temperate here, don't make a mountain over a molehill, and let's move forward. Tick it off your 385 resolutions and move on.
I would build off that a little bit, that I think that the UCP also has to see a huge opportunity that they have with post-secondaries right now. While obviously for students, the NDP policy around tuition freeze was really good for them, and it was very positive for them. A lot of universities are hurting when you talk about their ability to meet their infrastructure needs, their ability to pay for things. Like, they're in a position where they have felt really attacked in a lot of ways in terms of their ability to make money and take care of their institutions. And a lot of universities were welcoming of this potential change to look at how they could work around the funding for their institutions. So don't take that opportunity and then make enemies out of them for another 4 years. I think you saw what happened over the last 4 years where they felt attacked, or you had presidents of universities who were being publicly attacked by ministers. You had a lot of negative feelings from some post-secondaries. And so this is an opportunity to change that relationship. So this has to be a collaborative process. You can't just build the legislation in isolation. I think if you look, going back to the NDP again, at one of their first big missteps, regardless of the long-term outcome, Bill 6 was a huge misstep for the NDP, and that was because they did it in isolation. They built it, they didn't talk to anybody, they didn't engage anyone, they just did it. So what the UCP needs to do is engage university leadership across the province in these conversations and make sure that they're building this bill with them, not in spite of them.
I would agree with both of you, and I would the first question I would ask is why, because I do think that the question why would actually get to sort of the perception of what the UCP, what Jason Kenney perhaps see as what's happening at university campuses, and I balk at this idea that conservative voices are not heard on campuses. This is the province that gave birth to the Calgary School. It seems strange to me that people are saying conservative voices are not heard. And since I've been hearing this, I've been very careful in my classroom, at least, and I can only speak about what I do, to make sure that those voices are heard, or to try to construct an environment, and this is true, this has been true throughout my teaching career, but to try to construct an environment where people can disagree respectfully, that the classroom isn't Twitter. And for the most part, it's successful. Obviously, that's not 100% a success rate, but for the most part, it is successful. And so to say that conservative voices are not heard on campus, I think that might be a dubious claim to begin with, and that's where I would start. And to question why they believe that this policy, this legislation is necessary, when really what we're talking about is already covered by laws already in place. And that makes me really, really uneasy, because it suggests that perhaps this is a hammer, to come back to Dwayne's point.
Yeah, I guess,
Kevin,
go ahead.
Kevin, I might just wrap up with one thought about there isn't going to be consultation. I'd be shocked if it isn't tabled. It isn't already drafted and in the can. It's one of perhaps the first 12 bills. I'd be surprised if it isn't. I don't know where it's going to sit on the order paper, but they're going to do it fast.
I think that's a misstep, though. I think.
Yeah, it could be. And the second thing that I would say is, not only is there not going to be consultation, if you look at the post-secondary's challenges, the compliance costs that we've seen in post-secondary institutions with the reforms from 215 to 218. To give you an example, one institution alone in Edmonton, not the major university, it's $11 million. And there is no return on that investment. That is just, if I could say, overhead, pure compliance cost. And I think we need to put that money into people who are losing their jobs on heavy haulers to AI. They're going to lose it on trucks. These are people who, real working people who are are going to be displaced from the types of jobs that they've been able to raise a family on. And when I look at the priorities, this is not in the top 10. So in terms of what post-secondary institutions need to be successful, to get us ready for a transformative economy, both in terms of AI, in terms of moving off of oil. And I hope they do it fast, and then get on to the real business, and let's get post-secondary institutions ready to help our people get to work and figure out what they're going to do going forward.
So if this is not in the top 10 as you see it, and I would absolutely agree with you, this seems to be a manufactured issue. Is this, do you think, Kenney, Mr. Kenney, in some way paying back the interest groups that have helped him become successful and become our premier?
No, I think it's probably a lot simpler.
Pro-life.
I think it's a reflection of the people who worked on the policy platform, the Mark Milkies. This would be near and dear to his heart. Is it important to working people? I don't think so.
Well, and I think the other thing to highlight, like we talked about earlier, is that there are 385 promises in that platform. They're going to have a short session. They said today the session will end by July 5th. So that's about 6 weeks-ish for their first session. They have 3 major bills that they want to bring in around the climate, around the carbon tax, around the open for business stuff, some of the labor changes that they're going to make. So you're not going to see this being introduced until at least September, if that. I think that this is something that they've mentioned, that they've talked about. It's whether or not they actually act on it right away, because I think, again, you've seen from Kenney, Premier Kenney, a big change in that he campaigned to the right. He seems to be moving to governing from the center, which is what Harper did, which is a conservative way. That I think this is a little bit of like, I'm going to give this to my base as an idea of what we're thinking about. Whether or not he actually does it is a completely different thing.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that for me, I hope you're right that Kenney is governing from the center, but I'm suspicious.
Yeah.
In the sense that, like, just as an example, the whole I'm trying not to talk about the abortion topic, but in terms of this optics is where I think that this is an important point. He said something about the kids that walked out to protest the GSAs. He said that the kids I would rather have the kids learn in a classroom.
Yeah.
And he said nothing about that when these kids were bussed out from schools to go to the March for Life.
He also said that as a response to a direct question from a reporter. No reporter has asked him specifically about the March for Life. So that's one change and one nuance that I think is important, is he was at an announcement, he was specifically asked about it, he answered. He has not been asked about this. So
but to say that he wasn't asked about it and then not answer
I get what you're trying to say, but still.
I understand what you're saying too, but that's the optics of it, though, right? Yeah. Is that the perception of where Kenney is coming from? Kenney
is not going to touch abortion.
He shouldn't.
Not through legislation. Not through legislation, no. But there are other ways of making it more difficult.
I don't think he's going to touch it with a 10-foot pole. He learned a lot from Stephen Harper, and one of them is you do not touch contentious social issues if you want to be anything more than a one-term government.
No, you walk out then.
Well, he was in government then.
I know.
Fair enough.
Couldn't help but provide one little jab.
No, that's a fair enough point.
Yeah. Yeah. But my question to Kenny and my question to this policy would be, I hope that you're speaking to the student unions on the campus. I hope you're speaking to everybody, not just the free speech advocates, but the student union advocates that have to deal with both sides of these issues and are understand and really have a grasp of where the university and the post-secondary student is at. So I hope you are having legitimate conversations, and this is not something that you've pulled out of thin air because you think Doug Ford has a great idea.
But, at the same time, he doesn't really need to speak to student unions because he's attempting to hamstring them as well by making them opt in.
Sure.
I can't help myself. I'm sorry.
But I'm hoping.
I just don't think there's going to be any consultation at all on any of these bills, except for perhaps a labor bill if they do something around the wage reopeners. And that's because there's a constitutional requirement to consult. But this first round, I don't think there's going to be any consultation around it.
No, and Kenny actually specifically said that there wouldn't be. He said that by putting their platform out there and getting Albertans to vote on their platform, he considered that consultation.
Right. And unless constitutionally required, I just don't think they're going to do it. And if this is in that first batch, and I'm suspecting it is, that's why it was mentioned, but it's move it and done.
Yeah, with the exception of, like you said, labor stuff and anything that is related to the constitutional duty to consult. So some of their stuff around Indigenous issues will result in needing to consult with Indigenous communities. They won't consult, period.
Sure. Well, let's leave it there. We've had a great conversation. Just to let you people know, we are going to continue this conversation in a number of different ways. I do want to get a panel of LGBTQ people together to have a conversation around this, and I want to have some other groups on this as well. There will be a series of conversations around the concept of free speech on campus, because even though it's not a big politic, it shouldn't be the hugest priority of the UCP government. It is a conversation that I do think is important going forward. So I do intend to that, but I do appreciate you guys coming on. How do we follow you on Twitter? What are you guys up to? For those who are not following you on Twitter that want to follow you, but not and be respectful to you as well? I'm glaring at everyone. They just don't know it. How do we follow you?
It's Dwayne, and you can follow me at Citizen004.
Kristen. So I'm Kristen Rayworth, Kristin Raworth. There's a lot of Game of Thrones spoilers, so don't follow me until after next Sunday if you don't want to know what's happening.
Yes. Oh, by the way, I was going to ask, are you having a Starbucks coffee, and was it in this conversation for a couple of seconds and then edited out, or was it?
I'm still seeing it up and just having a glass of wine, being angry about how they've ruined all my favorite characters.
Fair. Okay. Jay, how do we follow you?
That's at Gary Swear. No, I'm kidding. It's at Dr. JAYDRNO. Dr. J, Dr. No.
All right. And of course, you can follow me at KEVOLE on Twitter. This was a great conversation. Thank you guys so much. I'm glad that the power of the podcast is the fact that you can have these respectful conversations and people will listen, hopefully. And we will talk to you all very soon. Bye for now.